The market town of Flaxborough had, as always, woken with the same gentle predictability that its inhabitants took so much pride in. Shop shutters rattled open in the cool morning, the bakery's scent of warm bread mingling with the faint tang of the river, and the church clock struck 8 with a punctuality that would have pleased any visitor, foreign or native. It was the kind of morning that whispered of civility and of quiet, largely harmless routine. Yet on this particular Wednesday, the subtle rhythm of town life was nudged ever so slightly by a stranger. He arrived in a carriage of modest elegance, the kind usually reserved for weekend visitors to the stately homes beyond Flaxborough's limits, rather than for the narrow streets of the town itself. His clothing was precise and unassuming, not the sort to draw attention, yet there was a certain something in the carriage's measured approach that suggested he expected, or at least hoped, to be noticed. The first to see him was Mrs. Penrose, of number 12 Larkspur Lane, who insisted upon commenting to her hairdresser that he looked exactly like someone who'd read books in dark corners and keep secrets in the folds of his coat. Mr. Penrose, meanwhile, merely shrugged, having long ago learned that his wife's observations often had the sound of prophecy. By mid-morning, the stranger had established himself at the small hotel near the square. He signed in under a name that sounded vaguely aristocratic but bore no trace in the usual directories, and he requested a single room on the second floor with a view of the market. The hotel staff, a pair of sisters devoted to efficiency, and the quiet gossip it bred, whispered among themselves. Miss Havisham found him faintly alarming, in a way that made one imagine one should curtsy or at least apologise, while her sister Mrs. Tyndall was more practical. He's here, he's paying, and he isn't nosing about the kitchens. I call that respectable. It was during the town's weekly council meeting, an event notable only for the polite irritation of petty arguments over street lamps and flower beds, that the stranger made his presence fully known. He entered quietly, nodded to no one in particular, and took a seat near the back. Councillor Bramley, whose authority was largely imaginary but ardently defended, scowled. "I wonder," Bramley muttered to his neighbour, "if he intends to interfere with our proceedings. Some of these strangers arrive with manners and others with mischief. I hope he's of the first sort." By lunch, a small stir had begun to circulate. At the railway buffet, a group of local businessmen debated his probable purpose. Some suggested he was a solicitor looking for work of discretion, others that he was a retired military man passing through on personal affairs. All agreed, however, that his quiet observance of the townsfolk was in itself slightly unnerving. Inspector Purbright, sipping his tea at the edge of the buffet, took no immediate notice beyond the polite acknowledgement that a stranger had arrived. He had long learned that newcomers could cause small disturbances in predictable ways, often before anyone had fully identified the problem. Yet there was a subtle peculiarity in the way this gentleman's eyes lingered on certain faces, an almost imperceptible scanning that seemed to account for both character and habit. Purbright noted it in his mind's ledger without judgment, reserving curiosity for a moment when necessity, or incident, might demand it. And by late afternoon, the incident arrived, though no one yet called it such. The hotel bell rang twice in rapid succession, a signal that brought Miss Havisham running from the front desk. She returned pale, clutching her apron. "Someone's fallen in the courtyard," she gasped. Well, Mr. Barnaby says he's quite badly hurt." Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. The injured party, Mr. Gerald Finch, the local solicitor known more for his long-winded lectures on wills than for any physical daring, lay on the cobbles with an expression somewhere between astonishment and indignation. No obvious injury suggested itself. He had tripped, it seemed, over a misplaced step, though the precise circumstances remained unclear. The stranger watched quietly from the doorway, expression serene, as the crowd fussed. He made no move to intervene, yet his calmness drew subtle, almost imperceptible attention. Mrs. Penrose, from her usual vantage across the street, whispered to a neighbour, "I dare say he had something to do with it. No one simply watches a man fall and look so untroubled." Purbright arrived shortly thereafter, not rushed but measured, and surveyed the scene with the detached patience that had earned him his reputation. He asked a few courteous questions, noted who spoke most and who avoided eye contact, and allowed the injured Mr. Finch to explain, in a series of increasingly aggrieved tones, exactly how he had tripped. No conclusion was drawn that day. The town, however, had a new topic for speculation. and the stranger, quiet, precise, and slightly unsettling, was already the centre of it. In Flaxborough, that was sufficient to cause a small ripple of anxiety, the kind that could, in time, grow larger than the actual incident itself. The town, as towns will, wasted little time in filling the hours between curiosity and speculation. By the following morning, the minor incident in the hotel courtyard had taken on a life of its own. In the shop fronts of the square, patrons murmured in subdued urgency, adding emphasis where none existed, while those with more idle time, such as retired Mrs. Elkins, insisted upon laying elaborate motives at the stranger's feet. Purbright moved quietly among them, notebook in hand, drinking tea in the cafe as if the day were no different than any other. He noted the peculiar blend of indignation and fascination in the townsfolk's expressions, cataloguing the layers of interpretation without offering comment. The solicitor, Mr. Finch, remained a figure of both sympathy and incredulity, repeating in meticulous detail the exact mechanics of his fall, which to the casual observer seemed entirely mundane. Yet it was in the small, odd details that Purbright's attention lingered. He observed that the stranger did not linger near the lobby after breakfast, but rather walked deliberately along the streets, pausing occasionally as if measuring not the town, but the people within it. When a child ran past with a kicked-up scarf, the stranger bent slightly, eyes briefly narrowing, then continued with a composure that suggested both interest and concealment. By midday, gossip had crystallised into conjecture. Councillor Bramley, determined not to be outdone, spoke at length in the railway buffet about the man's potential motives, ranging from espionage to a secret inheritance claim. Even the baker's assistant, usually concerned only with the correct ratio of sugar to flour, weighed in on the stranger's demeanour, citing an air of one who knows exactly where everyone keeps their minor secrets. Purbright, meanwhile, had begun the quiet work of inquiry. He first approached Mr. Finch, whose account, while detailed, contained subtle inconsistencies, small hesitations, overlooked details, the occasional embellishment, all unremarkable alone, but together forming a faint pattern. He then spoke with the hotel staff, who all remembered the stranger's calm observation, the slight tilt of his head when others spoke, the almost imperceptible pauses he allowed between words when addressed. In the late afternoon, Purbright made his way to Larkspur Lane, where Mrs. Penrose, eager for audience, elaborated further upon the stranger's arrival. She described the way he seemed to catalogue the street, nodding at certain houses and averting his gaze from others, and suggested, with considerable relish, that he had already formed opinions of every family in town. Purbright listened, making notes not only of her words, but also of the emphasis she placed upon them, the points she exaggerated for effect, and the points she omitted entirely. By the time the sun began its descent, the stranger had appeared again in the hotel courtyard, standing quietly as though waiting for something, or someone. A minor dispute arose over the hotel's flower beds, a clash between Miss Havisham and a visiting guest over the correct watering of petunias, which drew an unusually sharp glance from the stranger. No words were exchanged, yet his observations seemed to deepen the tension rather than ease it. It was in these accumulated trivial tensions that Purbright sensed the subtle interplay of the town's character and the stranger's presence. He understood that whatever mischief, or misfortune, had begun with Mr. Finch's fall, it would unfold not through obvious violence or dramatic action, but through the quiet irritations and hidden grievances that the townspeople carried like untended blooms. And somewhere within that slow-brewing disturbance, the stranger had planted himself, calm, deliberate, and as yet unreadable. As night fell over Flaxborough, Purbright returned to his modest office, the faint smell of ink and paper a familiar comfort. He reviewed his notes, considered the catalogue of small observations, and allowed a faint smile to cross his features. Nothing overt had occurred since the courtyard incident, and yet in the gentle tremor of ordinary life, he discerned the beginnings of a story that would require patience, tact, and an eye for those almost invisible details that marked the dividing line between mere curiosity and the truth. The following morning, Purbright began his quiet inquiries in earnest. His first calls were to those who had been present or nearby during Mr. Finch's unfortunate tumble in the courtyard. The solicitor predictably welcomed the attention with an air of aggrieved dignity, narrating once more the precise moment his foot had caught upon the stone step, each iteration more dramatic than the last. Purbright, however, listened with the kind of patience that encouraged candour, yet discouraged exaggeration. He asked gentle, seemingly casual questions about the surroundings, the angle of the sun, the placement of the garden pots, and the relative position of the stranger, whose calm observation had unnerved everyone else. From Mr. Finch, he learned little that changed the surface story. Yet, it was the small discrepancies, the shift of a window latch here, the misplacement of a pot there, that drew his attention. Finch insisted he had fallen on entirely flat ground, though his own recollection of stepping over a particular edging stone seemed uncertain. Purbright made a mental note, not because it implicated anyone, but because it marked an irregularity in the otherwise neat account. Next, Purbright spoke with Miss Havisham and her sister. Their description of the stranger was precise in manner yet vague in intent. He asked politely about the way he had moved through the hotel, what he had observed, what mannerisms might have seemed peculiar. Their answers were largely identical: an impeccable composure, a certain attentiveness, a calm that seemed almost theatrical in its restraint. From these interviews, a faint pattern emerged. The stranger appeared deeply interested in the ordinary routines of the town, yet without obvious purpose. Purbright noted the way he lingered near certain houses, and more curiously how he seemed to avoid others. There was nothing overt, but in the minutiae, the pause, the tilt of the head, the silent appraisal, Purbright detected a subtle attention that suggested an intent, as yet unrevealed. It was during a brief call on Councillor Bramley that a slightly more substantial contradiction surfaced. Bramley, keen to impress, had been eager to relay his theory of the stranger as a man of secret purpose, perhaps even of clandestine authority. Yet he accidentally misremembered the stranger's arrival time by several hours, a detail that would have mattered little if not for the careful observations of Mrs. Penrose, who noted the carriage's passage precisely. Purbright's interest was piqued, not because the inconsistency was dramatic, but because it hinted at the variations in perception and the subtle ways truth can be distorted by expectation or prejudice. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had walked the streets himself, unremarked but noted by those who had grown accustomed to the stranger's silent presence. He observed the hotel courtyard again, measured the step where Finch had tripped, and catalogued the positions of flower beds, benches, and doors. Each element, mundane in itself, took on significance only when regarded collectively. The stranger appeared once more in the courtyard, standing as before, his hands folded, watching the light move across the cobblestones. No word passed between him and anyone else. Purbright, watching discreetly from across the street, noted that several small interactions, the shifting of a chair, the nervous glance of a hotel guest, the slightly too loud greeting of a delivery boy, drew subtle reactions from the stranger. He did not act, yet his attention seemed to accumulate knowledge quietly, almost imperceptibly. By evening, the town had settled again into its accustomed rhythms, though an undercurrent of speculation persisted. Purbright returned to his office, reviewing the day's notes. The minor inconsistencies, the attentive observations, and the stranger's careful watchfulness coalesced into a pattern that was not yet crime, perhaps not yet motive, but certainly a signal that something lay beneath the surface. He allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Patience, as always, would be his guide, and in Flaxborough, patience often revealed more than haste ever could. The days that followed were, to the untrained eye, deceptively ordinary. The market hummed with its usual cadence, the baker distributed rolls with mechanical efficiency, and the council met and disagreed over the minutiae of street lamps and flower beds. Yet beneath this placid surface a quiet current of speculation had begun to ripple. The stranger's presence was noted more frequently now, his calm composure drawing both fascination and unease, and Mr. Finch, recovering from his courtyard tumble, found himself at the centre of conversations that suggested mischief more than mere accident. It was during one such exchange, in the railway buffet, that the first obvious suspect emerged in earnest. Mr. Samuel Redding, a solicitor's clerk with a reputation for minor resentments and a flair for gossip, was overheard expressing his conviction that the stranger had, somehow, orchestrated Finch's fall. He cited the man's precise observation of the hotel courtyard, his measured steps along the street, and the faintly disapproving tilt of his head whenever Finch moved in public. Purbright, seated at a quiet table, allowed the conversation to unfold, noting the emphasis and repetition in Redding's account. There was exaggeration certainly, but also a kernel of truth in what he observed. The stranger was attentive in a way few outsiders were. Later, Purbright made a point of visiting Mr. Redding. Their conversation was formal, courteous, and deliberately expansive. Redding spoke freely of the stranger, of Finch's fall, of subtle slights he imagined the newcomer had inflicted on local decorum. Yet in the telling, inconsistencies crept in. Redding claimed to have seen the stranger at 2 different locations at the same time, and misremembered the timing of minor events. Purbright listened with polite interest, making careful notes, and refrained from any immediate judgment. Other townsfolk contributed to the growing picture. Mrs. Elkins, who had made it her business to catalogue the stranger's every movement, insisted he had a calculated interest in the personal routines of select households. Councillor Bramley, still eager to assert authority, suggested that Finch himself might have provoked attention by his habitual fussiness, though the councillor's explanation lacked precision. Even the hotel staff offered small details. The stranger had adjusted a window latch several times, as though ensuring observation rather than comfort. He had lingered by the flower beds without touching them, yet somehow drawn attention from passers-by. Purbright, however, noted the most trivial but telling detail in silence. A small folded note tucked beneath a hotel plant pot, slightly damp at one edge, unnoticed by anyone but him. It was innocuous in appearance, a fragment of an envelope bearing neither signature nor date, but its presence, so easily overlooked, suggested a consciousness of observation that the stranger alone seemed capable of sustaining. As evening fell, the town's gossip had sharpened into conjecture. The stranger was now, in the eyes of many, a man of secret purpose. Mr. Finch's courtyard tumble had assumed a narrative of near malicious intent. Yet Purbright, in his calm, deliberate way, recognised that what the townsfolk perceived as motive might be entirely mistaken. He allowed the discourse to continue, cataloguing who claimed certainty, who embellished, and who avoided eye contact, understanding that human nature in Flaxborough often spoke louder than any single incident. By the close of the day, the first obvious suspect, Redding, with his eagerness to identify culpability, had revealed as much about the town's character as he had about the stranger. Purbright retired once more to his office, reflecting on the interplay between attention and assumption, and noting with quiet satisfaction that the story had begun to thicken in precisely the way it should, without spectacle, without violence, yet with every subtle sign pointing toward truths that, if carefully traced, would eventually emerge. Purbright's attention, as always, was drawn not to the loud assertions of the townsfolk, but to the small, almost invisible irregularities that suggested a story beneath the story. It was a seemingly trivial matter, observed one afternoon as he revisited the hotel courtyard, that first arrested his curiosity. A single teacup set carelessly on the ledge of a low wall bore a faint smudge of lipstick. Crimson, too deliberate to be accidental, yet oddly placed as if someone had set it down briefly and forgotten it. No one had remarked upon it. No one, except Purbright, had noticed the incongruity of a hotel guest leaving such a mark in a courtyard otherwise kept in meticulous order. He noted the precise angle of the cup, the slight tilt toward the path rather than the nearby bench, and the faint imprint that indicated both haste and intention. In Flaxborough, it was these small gestures that often concealed far more than any overt argument or accusation. His observations led him to retrace the stranger's movements that morning. Though most residents assumed the man had been idly wandering the streets, Purbright saw a deliberate path, past Finch's office, pausing briefly at the baker's window, across the square where the flower beds caught his eye. And always as he walked there were slight adjustments. The careful set of a hand on a gate, the measured glance over a shoulder, that suggested the presence of unseen attention. By mid-afternoon, he had questioned several more individuals casually and without confrontation, weaving his inquiries into the rhythm of ordinary conversation. The postman, for instance, remarked that the stranger had twice lingered near certain letters' delivery boxes, though he could not explain why. Mrs. Penrose, ever vigilant, suggested the stranger had seemed to favour the homes of those most socially prominent, yet avoided others entirely. Even the hotel staff, who prided themselves on noticing everything, admitted the teacup incident had gone unremarked, a detail that now, in Purbright's careful mind, spoke volumes. It was not dramatic, and it would have been easily overlooked by anyone who preferred overt gestures and loud accusations. But Purbright understood that human behaviour, especially when observed without distraction, revealed patterns that the best-laid assumptions of townsfolk could not. The mislaid teacup, the lipstick smudge, the slight misalignment of attention, all suggested an interplay of observation, interest and deliberate concealment that invited further scrutiny. By evening, he had begun to form a quiet hypothesis, not yet accusatory, but guiding. The first suspect, Redding, remained a convenient narrative for the town, yet the small details, the understated gestures, the unremarked habits, the misplaced objects, pointed toward another vector, entirely. Purbright retired to his office with the faintest sense of anticipation. In Flaxborough, such minor irregularities often accumulated until the larger truth, previously invisible, emerged in plain view. And he, as always, intended to observe until that moment arrived, patient as the town itself, yet alert to the subtle signals that would ultimately disclose what the townsfolk had only begun to sense in whispers. Over the next several days the inquiry quietly broadened. Purbright, as ever, observed without intrusion, allowing the town's natural social currents to reveal themselves. More characters now came into focus, each carrying their own small grievances and unspoken motives, each interacting with the stranger in ways that suggested both curiosity and apprehension. Mrs. Everett, the widow who kept a shop of odds and ends near the square, noted that the stranger had lingered longer than necessary in front of her window, appearing to examine a collection of brass trinkets. She had waved politely, only to receive a brief, measured nod, which she interpreted with some indignation as a judgment upon my taste. Mr. Pritchard, the local station-master, observed the stranger at the railway platform, pausing as if considering the arrival times of trains with more thought than was necessary for mere observation. He confided to Purbright that it gave him the uneasy feeling that someone was measuring the town, not merely seeing it. Even the children of Flaxborough contributed, though unwittingly. They noted the stranger's habitual avoidance of their games, the way he skirted around puddles as if expecting them to remain undisturbed, and the faintly amused glances he cast when one of their hoops strayed into his path. Purbright catalogued these observations with meticulous care, understanding that in a small town, even the most innocuous interactions carried information about character and intention. By midweek, the stranger's presence had prompted a subtle reordering of social habits. Afternoon walks shifted slightly. Shop visits were timed with greater precision. Casual conversations were conducted with lowered voices, as though acknowledging an invisible witness. Purbright took note of these changes not for their immediate impact, but for the way they revealed the underlying web of attention and anxiety that the stranger had begun to weave. The minor incident in the courtyard had receded from immediate memory, yet its effects lingered. Finch, still convalescing, found his reputation quietly questioned, the tale of his fall growing in detail and embellishment, even as the stranger remained neutral, neither consoling nor condemning. Purbright, in his understated way, recognised the pattern. The stranger's quiet presence was exerting influence, not by action, but by observation, by the mere fact of being noticed. One evening, in the gentle light of the hotel's courtyard, Purbright witnessed a subtle exchange. The stranger paused near a hedge, observing a conversation between two townsfolk who were discussing, in low tones, the question of Finch's competence and character. At that precise moment, a small leather-bound notebook, previously unnoticed, slipped from the stranger's coat pocket and rested against the roots of a nearby plant. He retrieved it with apparent casualness, but Purbright's practised eye detected the deliberate concealment, the slight hesitation, the awareness of being watched. It was the accumulation of such quiet gestures, minute yet telling, that provided the insight a less attentive observer would have missed entirely. By the week's end, the town had become a theatre of subtle tensions, each resident acting within the invisible boundaries of perception the stranger had, knowingly or not, set in motion. Purbright reflected on the human habits he had observed. The cautious self-editing of speech, the slight overstatement of civility, the small adjustments of posture and gaze. Each interaction, however trivial in isolation, contributed to a larger tableau that suggested motive and inclination. And in the quiet of his office, he began to see how the first incident, the courtyard fall, the misplaced teacup, and the stranger's measured attention all connected into a pattern that would soon require resolution. The calm rhythm of Flaxborough, carefully monitored by Purbright, was disrupted in a way that was neither dramatic nor violent, yet entirely sufficient to demand attention. One morning, Miss Havisham discovered that the hotel's front gate, usually secured with modest care, had been left ajar. There was no sign of forced entry, no disturbance of property, yet a single parcel, addressed in handwriting unfamiliar to the staff, had been left on the doorstep. It was neatly wrapped, tied with a ribbon, and bore a small label, "For the stranger." Word travelled swiftly, as words in Flaxborough were wont to do. The postman speculated, the hotel staff whispered, and even Councillor Bramley ventured an opinion on what this might signify, each explanation more elaborate than the last. Mr. Finch, upon hearing of it, insisted that it must relate directly to his fall, though the connection was, in truth, entirely unsubstantiated. Purbright, however, observed quietly, "The parcel, its careful placement, and the absence of any sign of haste or violence were precisely the sort of understated incident that demanded scrutiny. It was not the event itself that mattered, but the pattern it suggested. The stranger, previously enigmatic in his movements, had now become a silent participant in the town's unfolding story." He questioned the hotel staff, who reported seeing the stranger approach the gate earlier in the morning, pausing to glance up and down the street before retrieving the parcel with a composed deliberation. The movements were measured, purposeful, and yet devoid of any visible excitement or anxiety. Purbright noted the subtle precision, the tiny pauses that seemed to correspond with invisible social pressures, the glance at the street, the careful handling of the package, the brief hesitation before entering the hotel. As he walked the town in the late afternoon, he encountered several townsfolk who had observed the stranger's actions from a distance. Each account was slightly different. The baker's apprentice recalled seeing him adjust a flower bed edging as he passed, while Mrs. Everett described him standing still in the square as if weighing the collective behaviour of those nearby. These discrepancies were minor yet revealing. They suggested an acute awareness of the town and its routines, rather than an immediate intent toward mischief. Yet it was not the parcel itself that mattered most, but the effect it had on the town. Conversations became more tentative, movements more calculated. Finch, still recovering from his courtyard accident, found himself shadowed by both curiosity and unease. The first suspect, Redding, grew increasingly vocal, suggesting that this second incident confirmed his suspicions that the stranger had ill intentions, though his reasoning lacked substance beyond coincidence. Purbright, seated once more in his office with the late sun glinting against the window-pane, reviewed the accumulation of subtle actions and reactions. The first incident had seemed minor. The misplaced teacup had appeared trivial. Yet the parcel, the careful observation, and the town's quiet adjustment of behaviour indicated a pattern of influence that was intentional, if not immediately comprehensible. Human nature, he reflected, had a way of magnifying the inconsequential into significance, and the stranger, in his calm and unobtrusive manner, had become the catalyst. By evening, the town had settled into a subdued curiosity, each resident acutely aware of both the stranger and of their own behaviour in his presence. Purbright, ever patient, understood that the path to truth was neither rushed nor forced. The second incident had shifted the inquiry, moving suspicion away from the first obvious narrative and toward a subtler reality. The interplay of observation, attention, and minor provocations that would, with care, reveal both motive and method. And in that quiet anticipation, he prepared himself for the careful, civil unravelling that would soon be required. In the quiet of his office that evening, Purbright allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The town had settled into its usual rhythms, but beneath the surface he discerned a network of subtle anxieties, small pretensions and unspoken judgments. It was not merely the stranger's presence that mattered, nor the minor incidents that had punctuated the week, but the way in which ordinary people responded to observation, whether conscious or unconscious. He considered Mr. Finch, whose fall had set this chain of events in motion. The solicitor's indignation, his need to assert control over narrative and perception, had drawn attention to himself in ways both amusing and revealing. Finch believed himself the centre of scrutiny, yet in truth he was merely one of many, and the stranger's focus was far wider, far more patient. Redding, the first obvious suspect, had revealed more about his own disposition than about any external threat. Eager to accuse, he spoke freely, yet inconsistencies in his account suggested a mind more concerned with appearances than with facts. Purbright noted the familiar rhythm. Townsfolk often projected their fears or hopes onto a single figure, creating neat narratives that satisfied curiosity but obscured reality. The minor details, the teacup with its faint smear of lipstick, the carefully placed parcel, the subtle pauses and adjustments observed in the stranger's movements, had begun to coalesce into a coherent pattern. Observation, attentiveness, and a certain delight in the quiet manipulation of perception were at play. Purbright appreciated the elegance of it. No loud declarations, no dramatic gestures, merely the quiet orchestration of human behaviour, one imperceptible step at a time. He reflected on the peculiarities of social interaction in small towns. Civility, he mused, was often a performance, a mask worn to conceal irritation, envy, or curiosity. The stranger, with his measured gait and calm, precise attention, had become both audience and conductor, drawing forth reactions that revealed more about the townsfolk than about himself. And in that, Purbright recognised the path forward: careful observation, subtle testing, and patience. By nightfall, he had sketched in his mind a plan of gentle inquiry, a series of understated provocations designed not to accuse but to observe, to allow the guilty, or merely careless, to reveal themselves through instinct rather than explanation. Flaxborough, he knew, was a town of habits, of predictable gestures that, when subtly perturbed, could illuminate motives hidden beneath layers of courtesy and gossip. Purbright closed his notebook and leaned back, allowing the faint lamplight to cast soft shadows across the room. The resolution, he sensed, would come not from force or confrontation, but from the quiet interplay of civility and observation. The stranger had arrived, a catalyst of small disturbances, and the town had responded in ways both revealing and inevitable. In that patient anticipation, Purbright rested, knowing that the next steps, deliberate, civil, and unassuming, would bring clarity, and that the town itself would provide the final clues he required. Purbright chose his moment with deliberate care. The town, in its habitual evening calm, offered the perfect backdrop for a subtle, almost imperceptible test. He arranged to encounter the stranger at the hotel courtyard once more, under the guise of casual observation. The teacup and parcel had been removed. The courtyard returned to its tidy neutrality. Yet Purbright knew that even the simplest gestures could provoke revealing reactions. He engaged the stranger in polite conversation, speaking of minor details, the arrangement of flowers, the weather's unpredictability, the peculiarities of a town that prided itself on routine. The words themselves were innocuous, yet delivered in a measured cadence, allowing pauses and subtle emphasis to invite response. Purbright watched carefully, noting every flicker of expression, the slightest change in posture, the minimal hesitation before a reply. It was during a casual mention of the recent parcel, framed in the lightest possible tone, that the effect became evident. The stranger's eyes flickered briefly toward the spot where it had been left. His hand, almost imperceptibly, tightened around the edge of his notebook. No word betrayed his awareness, yet the small, involuntary gesture was unmistakable to Purbright. It was a signal, minute and disciplined, yet revealing. The parcel had mattered more than civility or composure allowed to be admitted. Purbright allowed a short silence to settle, then spoke of the courtyard fall, of the minor misplacement of the teacup, and of the curious attentiveness of certain townsfolk. The stranger maintained his calm, yet the subtle shifts, an eyebrow, the slight pause before continuing, provided the evidence Purbright required. These were not actions of mere curiosity. They were behaviours guided by awareness of perception, the manipulation of small incidents to produce outcomes unnoticed by all but the most observant. He did not accuse, did not raise his voice, and made no dramatic gesture. Instead, he continued the conversation, weaving trivial observations into the fabric of civility, allowing the stranger to reveal, through instinct rather than explanation, the depth of his involvement. By the close of the exchange, Purbright's calm, measured patience had succeeded in drawing forth the evidence of deliberate orchestration. The connection between courtyard, teacup and parcel, lay exposed in the mannerisms that no careful deception could entirely conceal. As the stranger excused himself with polite formality, Purbright remained seated, noting the subtle retreat of attention, the brief flicker of unease now concealed behind a mask of courtesy. In Flaxborough, he reflected, it was often the quietest gestures, the smallest deviations from routine that revealed the most. And with that understanding, he was ready to bring the investigation to its final civil resolution, confident that the truth would emerge calmly, thoroughly, and without spectacle. Purbright chose a calm afternoon for the resolution, inviting the key figures to the hotel's small drawing room under the pretense of a casual gathering. Finch, Redding, and the hotel staff, along with a few of the more observant townsfolk, assembled with a polite mixture of curiosity and unease. The stranger arrived with his usual composure, seemingly unconcerned, though his measured attention suggested he too awaited what was to come. Purbright began with quiet remarks on the courtyard, the arrangement of the flower beds, and the minor accidents and peculiarities that had recently occupied the town's attention. He spoke of human nature, of civility and perception, noting with gentle irony the ways in which minor events could escalate into speculation and suspicion. No one interrupted, all listened, some with apprehension, some with faint relief that the conversation had begun in such a mundane register. Then, with deliberate calm, he connected each detail. Finch's fall, he explained, had been entirely accidental, the product of a slight unevenness in the courtyard step and an unfortunate misplacement of a decorative edging stone. The first suspect, Redding, had been quick to assume malice, but his observations had revealed more about his own anxieties than about the stranger's intentions. Purbright's voice, measured and courteous, turned to the stranger. He spoke of the teacup and its subtle lipstick mark, of the carefully placed parcel and of the small gestures, the glances, the pauses, the attentiveness that had so thoroughly affected the town. Each instance, he explained, was deliberate yet devoid of malice. They were exercises in observation, designed to study the social responses of a town both predictable and charmingly intricate. The stranger, still calm, acknowledged with a polite nod, offering no more than a minimal smile, and in that understated gesture admitted the truth. He had arrived in Flaxborough not to harm, not to manipulate beyond the bounds of human curiosity, but to observe and engage with its rhythms, testing perception and civility without imposing violence or spectacle. Every small detail, every minor incident, had been designed to illuminate human behaviour, and in that he had succeeded. The room remained silent for a moment, absorbing the revelation. Finch relaxed. Redding's defiance softened into sheepish acknowledgement, and the hotel staff exhaled in relief, realizing that the incidents were not criminal, merely deliberate exercises in attention and social observation. Purbright, with his customary understatement, concluded with a gentle reflection on human nature, that small deviations from routine, when observed carefully, could reveal far more than any overt misdeed, and that civility, curiosity, and patience were sufficient guides to understanding, even in the most subtle of mysteries. As the group dispersed, the stranger offered polite farewells, returning to his quiet presence in the hotel and, later, the town's streets. Flaxborough resumed its usual rhythms, though a faint awareness lingered among its residents, a memory of the subtle disruptions and quiet revelations that had marked the week. Purbright returned to his office, content in the knowledge that the investigation had unfolded according to the town's own logic, and that the truth, calm and civil, had been brought to light, without spectacle or recrimination. The days that followed the drawing-room revelation returned Flaxborough to its characteristic rhythm, though subtle shifts persisted in the undercurrent of daily life. Finch, once self-conscious and easily ruffled, now moved with a quiet dignity, having reconciled the accident of his fall with the gentle, if pointed, lessons imparted by Purbright's exposition. He no longer lingered over minor grievances or fussed about small inconveniences. The town's citizens, in turn, treated him with a more measured attentiveness, as if acknowledging that the week's events had elevated both perception and patience. Redding, the erstwhile first suspect, maintained his social presence, though the sharpness of his earlier accusations had softened. He offered cautious commentary on new arrivals and events, always aware of the fine line between observation and projection, and in private he admitted to himself the humility that accompanies a misunderstanding resolved without recrimination. The stranger remained in town, yet his presence no longer inspired tension. Residents continued to note his attentiveness, but with curiosity rather than unease, appreciating the peculiar charm of one who watched the ordinary with such precision. The hotel courtyard returned to its quiet routine. The flower beds were restored to their accustomed symmetry, and the parcel, teacup and notebook passed into the realm of anecdote, discussed over tea and in passing remarks rather than alarm. Purbright resumed his desk work with the same deliberate calm he had exhibited throughout. Reports were reviewed, notes catalogued, and the orderly bureaucracy of the inspector's office proceeded, unhurried yet thorough. He reflected upon the town, the incidents, and the subtle interplay of behaviour and perception that had so captivated him. In Flaxborough, crime rarely erupted with force. It more often crept in with irregularities, with misperceptions, with minor provocations that revealed human nature in miniature. As evening fell and the lamps glimmered softly in the town square, life continued with its familiar cadence. Shopkeepers arranged wares with care, couples strolled beneath gaslight, and children's laughter rippled across the cobbled streets. Yet in the quiet observation of the everyday, Purbright noted the traces of the week's revelations: heightened attentiveness, gentler manners, and the subtle understanding that civility and patience often illuminated more than haste or accusation. The town had learned, without spectacle, the lessons that the stranger's presence had quietly imparted, and for Purbright there was satisfaction in the ordinary restored, in the rhythms observed and understood, and in the knowledge that the true measure of human character often emerged in the minutiae, rather than in grand gestures. With the case concluded, the inspector returned to his orderly routines, content in the calm and understated triumph of patient observation and civil inquiry,